Hello my dear friends, how are you? My name is Seidr and this is the second part of the concept of spinning and weaving in Seidr. The activities of spinning yarn and weaving fabric in Norse society, especially during the Viking Age, occupied most of women's time. It was almost a full-time job because it required very intensive labor to create outstanding amounts of woolen cloth, to be used in clothes, bags, tents, every imaginable bedspreads, and, of course, sails for ships, which in the Viking Age both their dimensions and numbers increased to such tremendous proportions that the weaving and spinning works almost seemed to be the first stages of industrialization during the Middle Ages of Scandinavia. It was an activity so time-consuming and very monotonous, which led people to constantly make the same movements, almost mechanical, permitting one's thoughts to drift away far into the depths of consciousness. As such, I'm quite sure women pondered about all sorts of things, including more exoteric matters and the concepts of the divine. Weaving and spinning was a very solitary activity behind doors, spending most of the time doing that work, and women could very well lose their minds with such a monotonous, lonely activity. So many women would come together and weave and spin in the presence of their female friends. They exchange knowledge, ideas and perceptions, enough time to question the nature of all things and experience with one another the conclusions they have probably come up with. So it shouldn't be surprising the groups of women doing their spinning and weaving would be labeled witches, forming a coven and conspiring against Christianity. An unfortunate idea, but with magical connotations nonetheless. Spinning and weaving became a metaphorical image for life, destiny or fate. In classic mythology, we have the Parcae and the Moirai, which are the personified fate of each individual, and the goddess Clothel spins the thread of life of each individual. In Norse mythology, we have the same, the Norns, who traveled to assign the future to each newborn child, or they themselves weaved the life thread of each being, and in some accounts carved the fate on wood. The spinning of fate and weaving of life threads associated with the Norns was done during the night. Nighttime was the reality the Norns lived and did all their works. Which is comprehensible, most of the weaving work was done during the night, indoors. Daytime was to work in the farm and to do other activities which required daylight. And let's not forget that in northern countries, most of the year the nights are much longer, and practically every activity was a nocturnal activity. Night for most women was the time to do their weaving and spinning works, spending most of the time sitting on a chair by the fireplace, listening to the creaking of fire, watching the dancing flames, tired of a day's work and try to be awake the rest of the night to finish their weaving and spinning. A time-consuming activity, tiring, mechanical movements, monotonous, and other external factors contributing to lull a person to sleep. Exhaustion and all these factors associated with the work of spinning and weaving might have contributed to naturally induce women into altered states of consciousness. Thus, the motif of women spinning and weaving the threads of one's life and weaving the tapestry of the community is a metaphor for the actual physical activity, which under certain circumstances became a highly symbolic act associated with magic and supernatural powers. The spinning and weaving activity was time-consuming, as I've said, but the entire process of preparing the wool for the actual activity of spinning was also a time-consuming manual process. Shear the sheep, washing and dry the wool, fluffed up and disentangled by hand, then combed with wool combs, A very delicate process, which I won't go into details. Suffice to say that the more accurate and meticulous the work is, the best results. The best fibers resulting in the best balls of yarn. A fine cloth required a fine yarn. A coarse wool will result in a coarse yarn, which in turn will produce a crude fabric. So at this stage, one must decide what kind of yarn to create according to the final product one wants. This is an entire process of creation, from the raw material of a living creature, going through an outstanding process of transformation by the skill of a person, all the way into a fabric for a variety of purposes, resulting in an almost metamorphosis of the material. This entire process of creation can be a metaphor for the process of creating life itself, giving shape to something, a purpose, a destiny. This entire textile work is a metaphor for what I've said in the previous video. Magic creatures in the form of balls of yarn and spindles with yarn, magic winds and whirlwinds, which are the physical shape of the mind of the practitioner of Seidr. This entire work of creating fibers, twisting them to create strings and weave them into something, is implicit in the art of Seidr. The practitioner of Seidr spins its mind, gives it shape, purpose, and sends forth its mind. The consciousness of the performer of Seidr, which comes in the form of magical beings or magical winds, is linked by metaphorical strings to the person, to the powers conjured, and to the will the Seidr performer can send forth. In a less complex way, this is portrayed in the magical creatures such as the Bjera and the Svorkat. If such creatures are injured or killed, so is the sorcerer who created them. The creature is bound to the practitioner of Seidr, linked by invisible life threads, spun and weaved by the Seidr performer to give shape to its own consciousness and send it to do something. This is why weaving and spinning tools are the symbolic tools used in rituals by Seidr practitioners. The distaff, for instance, in Old Icelandic rokra, and surprisingly in Portuguese roca. The Portuguese did spend a lot of time with Icelandic people and vice versa, but that's something for another time. The distaff is a very useful item for spinning, as it helps to keep the unspun fibers in order. In its simplest form is a wooden stick held between the knees. This is the symbolic tool of the practitioner of Seidr because it's directly associated with spinning activity. It's the person's staff, rod, wand, even scepter, the symbolic tool of power and a conductor of energy. The later representation of the tool with which the shaman hits the drum. And, as I've said before, holding the distaff between the legs to work on spinning and weaving is highly suggestive, just like a witch holds the broom while riding it. The distaff was symbolically the mount the practitioner of Seidr rode to perform acts of Seidr, just like the witch rode the broom and the shaman rode the drum, all metaphors for the exact same spiritual activity. As previously said, the word Seidr itself can help us to find a link to the spinning activity and why it's associated with fate. The word Seidr is etymologically associated with snare, cord, and string, a thread that is used to bind or catch spirits or other beings. The entire context of textile work takes place in female domestic environments, which in a patriarchal society, those were the places women had real power. In their monotonous, repetitive movements in spinning work probably helped to enter in a trance state of mind, not necessarily speaking of spiritual work, but speaking of mechanical movements. The entire work is almost a reflex. The person is so accustomed that even does it blindfolded. The fact of creating something out of practically nothing, making strings, transforming in cords with a fabric, it almost seems magical in nature. Spinning can therefore be seen as a metaphor for creation, for fertility and motherhood. Thus, also the connection with the spindle and the distaff, which have phallic shapes, and therefore the relation with fertility and other sexual connotations. In the work of spinning and weaving, such objects are innocent in nature, just mere tools. But such objects change their character when used in Seidr. In the hands of a practitioner of Seidr, the distaff changes its nature. In a couple of accounts, it's precisely the use of the distaff that conjures the sorceress tricks, and only those who are trained in such arts can see it's a trick. The distaff is the conductor of the mind of the sorceress, and by using it, it gives shape to the will of the sorceress. Seidr is a certain mind structure, a way of thinking that changes the function and property of things, a way of thinking which is able to manipulate minds and visual perceptions. The distaff is just a tool, something to help give shape to the will, but it's the decisions of the sorcerer, Seidkona, Volva, etc., that makes things happen, just like it's the decision of the person who prepares the wool before the actual spinning work, deciding what will be the final result of the entire process of creation. First, making the right decision to achieve the wanted result. The entire magical work in Seidr is just like the entire process of creating a fabric through spinning and weaving. Deciding, preparing, transforming, giving shape and creating. Since Seidr was an activity closely associated with women and their lonely activities within their domestic domains, Seidr rituals served a variety of household purposes, such as divination and clairvoyance, finding things hidden in the mind as well as in physical locations, healing purposes, good luck, influenced weather, and for successful hunts. But obviously for the exact opposite of all these things. Battle magic was another important aspect of Seidr, having influence on the outcome of a battle. And this goes far back into the Germanic traditions of the chieftain's wife being the sorceress of the tribe, and through divination predicting the outcome of a battle, and through active magic she could influence and alter that outcome. About battle magic, there are interesting accounts, and it wasn't that pretty. To be honest, nowadays there seems to be a great flourishing of Old Norse traditions and a comeback. But people seem to do precisely what they have done with Celtic traditions, romanticizing the truth and give it a little drop of fantasy like in fairy tales. Sometimes people portray the pagans as the victims of Christianity, which they certainly were, but the portrait is often clouded by the wrong image that pagans were just dancing naked in the forest and living their happy lives in peace. We must not forget that ancient pagans were humans, and cruelty is a trait of people who lived very violent lives within very violent societies, lives closer to the cruelty of nature, and in response they were also very cruel. Some of the accounts we have of battle magic come from myths, folklore, sagas and poems, but that doesn't mean such accounts do not portray the truth. On the contrary, myths explain the unexplainable by adding very real elements people are familiar with. We have an account of Valkyries weaving a battle, creating a terrible textile work with blood-stained grey cloths made of human intestines and heads, chanting magical spells over it while moving back and forth in the process of weaving. Bloodthirsty women in screaming laughter, eager to engage in combat and excited in creating a bloodbath. This is magic of total violence and destruction. That's the purpose. When the Valkyries have completed their work, they tear it apart, destroying what they have created. This shows the very pagan understanding of spiritual force residing in objects. I've said this before. Throughout Europe since the Bronze Age, pagan cultures gifted the gods with a variety of objects created by their own skill and then destroyed them precisely to release the magic in it. People were not offering the gods the objects, people were offering their own essence, which resided in the objects when they created them, when they have placed their ideas, thoughts, will, skills in the very creation of the objects. When the Valkyries destroyed their work, was precisely so their own will, which had been given shape through the creation of a fabric, could be released and make things happen, make the purpose of that magic happen. I'm not going into details about this specific account of battle magic. I leave that to an academic work of mine which I've published on my Patreon precisely with the release of this video. So for more details, just check my Patreon. On that academic work I give more examples. It's about Seidr and this weaving and spinning concept. Suffice to say that in Seidr things weren't that magical and pretty. This particular account shows very real ritual performances in the magic of Seidr. As I've said before, in Seidr, different rituals and techniques were used for different purposes, and some were quite bloody and violent. The description of this one in particular looks like the lyrics of some very dark black metal band. In conclusion, the concept of spinning and weaving in Seidr is a metaphor for the magical work which involves a psychological ability to take relative control over minds and places by giving shape to the will. We can imagine the hypnotizing factor in the monotonous circular movements of the spindle by which the wool is transformed in a thread to give shape to a fabric. A metaphor for spinning the thread of life itself, giving shape to the desire of creating something and giving it a purpose, a destiny. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and before you go, just a little information. If you want to know more about Seidr and other magical activities within the Norse traditional paganism, I recommend you to visit Ravadis. He's a friend of mine who really knows his stuff when it comes to magical works within the Norse traditional paganism. On the comment section I will leave the links to his YouTube and his Patreon. And if you want to read my academic work about Seidr and this concept of spinning and weaving, just visit my Patreon as well. So, thank you so much for watching and see you on the next video. Tack för idag!